They say the forest remembers, not in words, not in thoughts, but in whispers, leaves rustling without wind, trees groaning like old bones, the earth itself humming with secrets. At the heart of that forest stood a ruin, a cathedral that no map recorded. Its towers were broken, its bells long shattered, its doors chained in rust. Yet still, the villagers swore there was music, not ordinary music, not the echo of birdsong or the howl of storms through stone. No, this was something else. Voices, countless voices. They said if you passed too close to the ruins at night, you would hear a choir singing in perfect harmony, low and mournful, like a funeral dirge, high and piercing, like angels in grief. Hundreds of voices, layered into something too vast, too heavy for human throats. But the church was empty, always empty. Hunters who strayed too near never returned. Travelers, drawn by the sound, vanished without a trace. Sometimes their horses wandered back to the village, saddles soaked in blood, reins torn, eyes wide with terror. But the riders, they were gone, and so the cathedral became a forbidden place. Parents warned their children, elders cursed its name, priests forbade it in sermons. But silence is never enough to bury a secret. It was a scholar who broke that silence, a man with more curiosity than caution. He had heard the stories while passing to the village, how the church sang, how the lost were claimed. Most laughed it off, saying it was madness, superstition. But the scholar, he felt something different. There were records, old and brittle, tucked away in archives. He had read them before, fragments of manuscripts that spoke of the Black Choir, a sect lost to time, a brotherhood of singers who did not breathe. Their music, it was said, was not made with lungs or throats, but with the dead themselves. The scholar could not resist. He journeyed into the forest with lantern, ink, and parchment. The deeper he went, the quieter the world became. No birds, no insects, not even the crack of branches underfoot. The forest was holding its breath. By the time he reached the ruin, the sky was heavy with clouds. The cathedral loomed before him, broken but proud, its stained glass windows shattered into jagged teeth. The doors sagged beneath the weight of centuries, chains binding them shut. And then he heard it. At first, he thought it was a wind, a low hum, faint, almost imperceptible. But then it grew, voices, dozens, then hundreds, rising and falling in harmony. A sound too perfect, too unnatural. The song was mournful, but within it lay something darker. Hunger, grief, rage. The scholar's hands trembled as he wrote notes in his journal. He had found it, proof that the choir existed. But as he listened, he realized something else. The voices were not singing words. They were crying, crying in agony. He searched the ruin's perimeter, desperate to see inside. And there, by a crumbled wall, he found an opening. Inside, moonlight filtered through broken stone. Dust hung thick in the air. The altar lay shattered, but beneath it, bones. Dozens of bones, arranged in careful patterns, like instruments waiting to be played. Skulls stacked into columns, ribs woven into lattices, spines laid out in rows like organ pipes. The choir, and as the scholar gazed, the song grew louder, but not in his ears. It was in his head. He clutched his skull, eyes burning, temples pounding. The song clawed its way into him, digging deep. It whispered memories that were not his own, men choking, women screaming, children weeping in the dark. He staggered back, lantern shaking, heart racing. The bones were not silent. They were singing. That night, he fled the ruin. He told himself he would never return. But the song did not leave him. Even in the village, miles away, he heard it faintly at night, a soft chorus in the back of his mind, rising when he tried to sleep, twisting into nightmares. And worse, The villagers began to notice. They saw him humming unconsciously, his lips moving without thought. They heard his voice layered into the chorus, though he swore he wasn't singing. The black choir had chosen him, and the first note had only just begun. The song never left him. The scholar carried it back to the village like a plague. By day, he tried to convince himself it was fading, that it had been nothing but imagination. But by night, the voices grew louder. He woke gasping in the dark, clutching his throat, sure that someone was singing through him. When he looked in the mirror, he swore he saw his mouth moving while he slept. Sometimes it was still moving even after he woke. The villagers began to avoid him. They said his eyes looked wrong, too sunken, too restless. They said he murmured when no one else was speaking. Children swore they heard him humming in alleys at night, even when his house was locked and dark. And always, he dreamed the cathedral. One night, the dream shifted. The ruined church was no longer empty. He saw candles burning in rows, hundreds of them, their flames bending not upward but toward the altar. Robed figures stood in silence, their faces hidden beneath shadowed hoods. And though their mouths were sewn shut, their chests rose and fell with breath. They were singing, not with their mouths, with something else. Their song shook the ground. It rattled his bones. It climbed inside his ears and tore the edges of his mind. And then he woke to the sound of bells. The village bells had not rung in decades. The tower had long collapsed, its stones buried under moss. Yet in the dead of night, the air shuddered with a heavy toll. The villagers poured into the streets, lanterns raised, faces pale with fear. They all heard it, that dreadful hollow peal, coming not from their ruined tower, but from deep in the forest, from the cathedral. The scholar's blood froze. He knew then the choir was no longer dreaming. It was awake. By morning, the first grave split open. In the small cemetery at the edge of town, families gathered to find earth upturned, coffins shattered. But no bodies remained. The ground was empty, save for faint lines of ash leading toward the woods. Those who followed the trail claimed they heard faint music on the wind, just a single note stretched thin, like the hum of a tuning fork pressed into their skulls. By nightfall, more graves yawned open, not just in the village, but in every hamlet for miles. The dead were leaving their rest, pulled by a song no living ear could resist. The villagers tried to lock their doors, to pray, to stay together in groups. But the choir's music seeped through wood and stone. It began quietly, a hum in the walls, a whisper on the floorboards. Then louder, voices in the chimneys, harmonies rattling the glass of their windows. Children clutched their ears, screaming that they could hear the crying. Elders wept, recognizing familiar voices in the chorus, the long-buried dead, singing in anguish. And then the humming spread. First the animals. Dogs whined in unison. Cows bellowed a broken note. Birds perched in silence, their throats straining as if some other voice moved through them. Then to the villagers themselves. At first it was just one man, humming unconsciously as he sharpened his blade. Then a woman, rocking her child to sleep, her lips trembling with sounds she did not choose. Then another, and another, until at last the entire village was humming together. The choir had found its chorus. The scholar tried to warn them, his voice ragged, his eyes hollow. "It's not just a song," he pleaded. "It's a summoning. Every note is a chain, every voice a sacrifice." But even as he spoke, his lips trembled. The melody poured through him like a parasite. The villagers stared, their eyes glazed, their heads tilting toward the forest. And then, without a word, they began to walk, lanterns swinging, feet dragging, dozens of them moving in unison, like sleepwalkers, toward the cathedral. That night, the scholar followed them. He had no choice. Through the black trees, the sound grew louder, hundreds of voices woven into harmony, rising, falling, weeping, calling. The villagers walked without fear, without resistance, their bare feet bleeding against the stones, their mouths trembling with music not their own. When they reached the ruin, the chains on the doors were gone. The cathedral stood open, glowing with candlelight, and there they were, the cult, dozens of robed figures, their mouths crudely sewn, faces hidden in shadow. They lifted their arms in welcome, their bodies swaying to the rhythm of the unseen choir. The villagers filed in like sheep, their own voices folding into the chorus. And from deep inside the cathedral came a sound no human throat should ever make. 1,000 voices rising at once, howling, mourning, worshiping. The choir was awake. Silence. That was the strangest thing. Not the singing, not the bodies that moved without breath, but the silence that followed. When the villagers entered the cathedral, their voices swelled to join the choir. The scholar stumbled after them, clutching his head, his body trembling with every note that wormed into his bones. And then it stopped. The night went dead still. No rustling of trees, no call of owls, not even the scurrying of rats in the ruins. The entire forest fell mute, as if the world itself was listening. The choir had sung its first hymn, and the silence was its reply. In the days that followed, travelers who passed through the forest noticed it first. They spoke of walking for hours without hearing so much as a bird. No insects, no water, no wind. Just stillness, vast, suffocating stillness. And then, they said, came the sound. Not a melody, not a human note, just a low vibration, humming in their teeth, bending in the air, like a funeral dirge played on strings made of bone. Many turned back before reaching the village. The few who pressed forward were never seen again. The scholar wrote furiously in his journal, his hands shaking. He no longer trusted his own memory, for he often woke with pages filled in handwriting he did not recall making, lines of music scrawled between his notes, symbols in ink that shimmered faintly as if alive. He read the words aloud once, just once, and the walls bled. The silence spread beyond the forest. In neighboring towns, bells failed to ring. Taverns went still, no laughter, no chatter, no arguments. Priests raised their voices in prayer, only to find the echoes swallowed. And then voices began to vanish. First a child, waking in the morning with no sound in her throat. Her mouth moved, but no cry came. Then a farmer, his shouts to his oxen swallowed by the air. Then entire families, struck dumb overnight. Doctors claimed it was sickness. Priests called it punishment. But the truth crept quickly. The choir was stealing voices, not killing them, stealing them, adding them to its song. The scholar grew gaunt, sleepless, his skin pale as wax. His reflection no longer matched his face. The mirror showed a mouth sewn shut with black thread, his eyes dark hollows. When he blinked, it blinked later. When he screamed, the reflection smiled. He knew then that the choir had marked him as a vessel. One night, he ventured into the woods again, drawn not by will, but by compulsion. The trees loomed taller, blacker, as if their branches strained to hear. The silence pressed heavier with every step, until the world felt drowned, smothered. And then, faintly he heard it, not singing, breathing, dozens of lungs inhaling in unison. The dead, the villagers, the cult, all waiting, all silent, until the first note broke the stillness like a scream. The hymn began again. This time, it was not just in his head. The ground shook, the trees bowed, the skies seemed to darken, and from a ruined cathedral, light poured upward, not firelight, but pale, cold illumination, like moonlight turned to ash. Inside, the villagers stood in rows, mouths open, no sound leaving them, and yet their voices filled the air. The cult swayed, arms raised, their sewn mouths bleeding as they forced a song through broken throats. And above them all, in the shadows of the altar, something moved, something vast, something faceless, the source of the choir. The hymn ended with a final note, a blast that shook the forest for miles. And then came silence again. But it was not the silence of absence. It was the silence of death. When dawn came, the next town over was found empty, beds still warm, meals half-eaten, doors ajar. No bodies, no blood, just silence. The choir had spread. The scholar fell to his knees, his journal clutched to his chest, ink dripping from his fingers like blood. He whispered, not to God, but to anyone who might one day find his words. The choir does not sing to us. We are only the instruments. The song is not meant for our ears. It is meant for something waiting, listening. And when the last voice is taken, the silence will end, and the world will hear what comes next. The silence was no longer confined to the forest. It had crept into towns and villages, swallowing their voices, their lives, their very presence. But now, the silence had grown bold. It marched openly across the land, spreading like a black tide, leaving nothing but empty homes and hollow streets in its wake. The first city to fall was Caliph, a place of trade, filled with bells and markets, laughter and noise. All gone. Witnesses who fled in time described a sound, low, mournful, and unrelenting, that bled through every crack of the city's walls. It began in the cathedral. The bells tolled at dawn, but the sound was wrong. Deep, dragging, as though rung by dead hands. By noon, the bells tolled again, and every voice in Caliph fell silent. By nightfall, 50,000 people stood in the streets, mouths open, eyes glazed, their voices stolen, yet the hymn filled the air. The choir had claimed its first city. The scholar's journal grew more frantic, the ink blotched and smeared as though written in haste or with trembling hands. He wrote of visions, dreams that were not dreams, of standing in endless crowds, all singing with mouths sewn shut, their blood dripping down their chins, of a black cathedral that rose above them, higher than mountains, higher than clouds, built not of stone but of human bones. And always in those dreams he heard the same words whispered, the silent Massachusetts. Soon more cities fell. Travelers carried the silence with them, unknowing messengers of the choir's will. A merchant caravan rolled into Bristol, and by dawn every stable hand, every tavern girl, every gar along the walls had joined him. Priests attempted exorcisms, calling on the name of God to banish the evil. But no prayer carried beyond the altar. Every sermon died in the throat. Every candle guttered and blackened. And those priests who stood firm soon found themselves humming him as blood poured from their eyes. The choir was not content with silence alone. It wanted ritual. It began with small gatherings. Survivors who swore they had resisted him were later found in ruined chapels, their lips pierced shut with needles, their bodies swaying as the song forced its way out of them. Soon, entire congregations were claimed. The silent mass had begun. The scholar himself was no longer certain whether he wrote his thoughts or the choir's. His journal was filled with diagrams of altars that did not exist, maps of cities yet to fall, names of people he had never met. Worse, he found himself humming in his sleep. His neighbors heard him through the walls, low notes that shook the boards, words in a tongue that burned their ears. When he woke, his throat was raw, his pillow soaked red. He could not remember singing, but the hymn was lodged in him like a thorn. He feared he was no longer merely a witness. He feared he was becoming a vessel. The silent mass spread across the continent. Refugees fled from town to town, but found the same fate awaiting them. Empty cities, hollow villages, doors swinging in the wind, streets littered with abandoned possessions, yet no bodies, no cries, no screams. Just silence. And then the hymn. Always the hymn. One night, the scholar dreamed of the black cathedral again. This time it was closer. He could see its gates, vast arches of bone, chained with iron, pulsing as though alive. He could see the congregation, endless rows of the voiceless, heads bowed, stitched mouths bleeding. And at the altar stood a figure cloaked in shadow. It raised its hands, and the entire congregation lifted their heads. and though their mouths were bound, their voices erupted together, a sound so powerful it split the dream in two. The scholar woke screaming, his journal open beside him. On the page, in his own hand, were the words, "The Mass is not an ending, it is a summoning." The world was not dying, it was being prepared. The world had grown quiet, not in patches, not in towns or cities alone, but everywhere. Entire continents stood still beneath a suffocating blanket of silence. The oceans carried no waves. Forests swayed without sound. Even the winds that howled across mountains seemed strangled, trapped in their throats. Humanity still lived. Millions of bodies still walked, but their voices no longer belonged to them. They had been taken, twisted, folded into one vast, eternal hymn. The choir had become the world. The scholar wandered among the ruins of nations, his journal clutched to his chest, though his hands bled from writing. His skin was paper-thin, marked with faint notes and sigils, as if the ink had seeped to the pages and into him. He had resisted longer than most. But now, even his silence trembled with the hymn. He heard it when he breathed. He heard it in his pulse. He heard it when he closed his eyes, not with his ears, but with his very soul. And in his dreams, the black cathedral towered ever nearer. Its spires pierced the sky, its shadows stretching across the earth. And always at its altar, the faceless figure waited. The final summoning began on a night without stars. Across the earth, the stolen voices rose as one. From empty cities, from hollow churches, from desert and oceans, millions of throats opened. Their mouths did not move. Their lungs did not breathe. Yet the sound came forth. A single note at first, low, shaking the bones of mountains. Then another, higher, weaving above it. Then a third, piercing the heavens. A chord vast enough to split the world. The final hymn had begun. The scholar stumbled to the ruins of the village where it all began. The cathedral was gone now, collapsed into rubble, yet the hymn echoed louder here than anywhere else. He fell to his knees, clutching his ears, but there was no use. The sound was not around him. It was inside him. And then, through the rubble, a light grew, not fire, not flame, but pale and cold, stretching upward into the heavens. The ruins rebuilt themselves in reverse, stone rising into air, walls sealing, spires were forming. The cathedral stood once more, taller and darker than ever. Its gates yawned wide. The silent mass had gathered. Row upon row of the voiceless filled the pews, their sewn mouths bleeding as they sang. The walls themselves pulsed with sound, veins of crimson coursing through the stone. The air shook, thick with the weight of something vast pushing against it. And then it came. From the altar rose the figure, cloaked in shadow, faceless, towering. Its hand stretched outward, and the hymn swelled to a breaking point. The very sky cracked above the cathedral, fissures of black and red tearing across the stars. The scholar's journal fell open in his lap, pages flapping in the unnatural wind. Words burned themselves across the parchment in glowing ink. It was never a song. It was a key. The hymn was opening something. The cracks in the sky widened. Behind them lay not heaven, not stars, but void deeper than darkness itself. Something moved within it, something with wings too vast a measure, with eyes that burned brighter than suns, with a mouth so wide it could swallow worlds. It leaned close to the fracture, pressing against reality itself. The hymn screamed louder, the stolen voices tearing themselves apart to widen the gate. The faceless figure at the altar bowed, and the thing beyond began to emerge. The scholar screamed, but his scream joined him, swallowed, twisted, reshaped. His throat tore open, black thread spilling forth. He realized too late he had always been part of the choir. His resistance, his writings, his very life. Nothing more than another verse in the final hymn. The gate split wide. The thing stepped through. And with a sound that was not a sound, a note too vast for human comprehension, the world ended, not with fire, not with blood, but with silence.